Morning. Okay, let's get things started with a terrific panel to kick things off. This panel is called Ransomware, Encryption, and Extortion Attacks. What to do when you get the call. And we have an incredible first panel to get things started. Let me start with our moderator, Kari Rollins, who is a partner in the intellectual property practice group at Sheppard Mullin. And Kari focuses on data privacy and data security, and she helps clients before, during, and after the inevitable data breach. She's joining us today from Manhattan. Welcome, Kari.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Happy to be here.
Next, Jennifer Archie is a partner at Latham and Watkins. Jennifer is really a true pioneer in the US and abroad in the area of privacy and data breach. Editor of the Global Privacy and Security Compliance Law blog, as well as spoken all over the world as an IR expert. And she's joining us today from Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome, Jennifer. Great to see you. Will Daugherty is a partner and head of cybersecurity at Norton. Will has led organizations through hundreds of data security incidents. These include many matters in the payment card industry and across other industries such as airlines, financial institutions, energy companies, retailers, and a lot more. Will is joining us today from Houston, Texas. Welcome, Will.
Thanks, Bruce.
I'm very pleased to welcome Evan Roberts, who's a managing director at FDI Consulting. Evan he has cybersecurity experience in a broad range of scenarios: ransomware attacks, large-scale data exfiltration, spear phishing attacks, and others. Evan is joining us today from Manhattan. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you, Bruce.
Finally, let me introduce Michelle Visser. She is a partner at Orrick. She defends and counsels companies through their cybersecurity incidents with an eye towards potential litigation. She also offers them proactive advice on how to structure their cybersecurity and incident response plans in ways to reduce legal exposure. And very kind of Michelle to join us from San Francisco at this hour. Thank you so much, Michelle. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Bruce.
All right, Kari, let me turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you for the introductions, and thank you for having us all here today to talk about, dare I say, everybody's favorite topic, ransomware. Appropriately, as the first session of the day, we're going to be talking with you about the various work streams to prioritize, issues to spot, decisions to make, and pitfalls to avoid in the first 48 hours, as well as throughout the company's response to a ransomware attack. The goal being for us to provide you with practical tips and takeaways to utilize in building your own incident response plan or testing that plan, or generally just preparing your organization for what to expect. Because from our perspective, and though it's going to be covered in a later session today, preparedness and testing in advance is just as critical to an effective ransomware response as is the response itself. And before we dive in, I just want to clarify that when we say ransomware, we're not just talking about the traditional wholesale encryption event that you may be familiar with, where the threat actor organization encrypts your systems and holds access to those systems for ransom. Ransomware today takes many different forms, and those different forms may trigger different initiatives and work streams and decisions to be made, which we'll address throughout our discussion. Ransomware could also involve not only just encryption, but also extortion and exfiltration, something called double extortion, where the threat actors encrypt your systems and then prior to the encryption, exfiltrate data, sometimes terabytes of data, and then hold for ransom access to your systems and the threat of disclosing that data. Ransomware is also evolving today into almost purely exfiltration and extortion attacks, where you have threat actors reach out proactively to companies and say, hey, I've exfiltrated terabytes of your sensitive data. I'm going to release it publicly or sell it unless you pay me X number of Bitcoin. And oh, by the way, I still have a foothold in your system. And if you don't pay me or you delay, I'm also going to encrypt your system. So that's a new iteration of ransomware that we're seeing and that we'll address today as well. And the data being exfiltrated, which we'll also talk about, which also factors into decision-making, isn't just your traditional PII that may trigger notification obligations, but it's other sensitive or highly sensitive information for the organization or its employees. For example, in an awful incident that I experienced with a client there, where not so appropriate or naughty photos an employee had taken with their company issued phone and which had backed up to the company issued cloud storage, and the threat actors were exposed, were threatening to release those naughty photos. There are also instances where they perform detailed reconnaissance to identify potential mergers or acquisitions or sales and threaten the disclosure of those highly confidential deals, which could cripple the deal or materially, financially impact the company materially. So they are getting more creative. So when we talk about the work streams today, we'll also highlight incidents where you may have decisions to make that are different depending on the type of ransomware attack. So to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, who's going to walk us through what to do in the first 48 hours when you get that phone call. Your company has been attacked, your systems are down. So what work streams do you need to prioritize? What should you do first? Jennifer, over to you.
Great to be here, everybody. So I'm a big fan of, having some, a framework, at least mentally in your head on in a crisis, because beyond just detailed checklists of things, it's good to just, like in law school, before we learned a small point of law, we wanted to know the name of the class and what the tree looks like. So for security 101, we've all been trained that security involves three things: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And what's very challenging about ransomware is it potentially can, hit all three of those security problems. Data may have been stolen. The integrity of the systems and records can be really compromised by the fact that you need to either restore from backup or decrypt. And you can have just rank availability and outages that could be unavailability of data, or it could just literally be the assembly line can't run. It could be operational technology. It could be SCADA. It could be anything. So when you're doing triage on the crisis in the very beginning, those three buckets are something really important to say, what security issues are at risk for me. It's going to drive the vocabulary that Evan uses in statements. It's going to drive the experts that you retain, but that triage of just what kind of a security event am I experiencing and thinking CIA is helpful. Another rubric we all know for security that's really helpful in the first 24 hours is to think about the fact that security programs are judged on the basis of people, process, and technology. And so a security crisis or event also needs you to think about each of those three components pretty specifically. So I'm going to hit on it really fast and then we'll develop some of it. But in terms of people, if you have these kind of operational disruptions or theft of large data or personal information or something, you can see internally that it's a different group that needs to be in the war room on day one than you would have if someone had just compromised a consumer database or stolen trade secrets as an employee or something. So it's we find that sometimes those people have not been as trained on the IR plan, right? They're running a whole business unit. They're operational people. They don't know that. So, but yet they have sort of the key information that you need to have an integrated view about time to recover, all these different decisions you need to make. So first scrub people internally and think beyond your little IR plan that might have said HR and, these people they're indispensable, but because you have to look to where the disruption is, to data or process, and make sure you pull those people in from minute one and give them an orientation. Secondly, on people is external. There are special types of experts, and even within categories that you know and love from other kinds of incidents, there are specialists in this area. And so it's critical that, and we're going to build on this later, that you involve threat intelligence from day one. So don't be like, I don't need someone to help me pay ransom because I'm not going to pay it. That same team is going to be your threat intelligence team. They're going to tell you, here's the type of ransomware variant you have. In 99 of the last 100 times when you paid, you got the data back, or you got a deletion, or you need that intelligence from minute one. Somebody needs to type the attacker and the situation that you're in. PR, you very, very, very likely to have that forced on you externally because disruptions are visible, right? They're visible to your customers, or they're visible to security people, or, your data's, teased on the dark web, whatever, PR day one. Elite technical firms. The difference in your time to recover and your resolution of this means it can depend, maybe most importantly, on matching the right elite vendor to what your triage was on what your security challenge was. So just because you signed someone up and said, we're always going to work with so-and-so, they may be perfect, especially if they're in that elite tier. But, lawyers and others involved that are quarterbacking the incident need to really stop and think, this is my crisis. This is the medical thing that showed up at the ER today. I'm going to make sure I call the right doctor. And then the fourth unique outside resource I'd mention is our expediters and firms. I'll mention, Mox 5, West Monroe. They're on the list from your insurance panel. But if your root cause was not having multi-factor authentication properly deployed in all the different domains of your organization, fix it right away. Don't wait to the end. And the insurers recognize that, and they've lined you up with, vendors for that. So that's people. Process is be prudent and realistic about privilege. Privilege is not the destination of the project. Privilege is a really important thing to be prudent about. But the resolution lies beyond it's not defined by privilege. The single source of truth for process is like day one, somebody's in there writing it down. And we already talked about technology that goes along with the people, is making sure that the vendors that come in can give you an answer on your situation within 3 to 4 days, not 3 to 4 weeks. And I think that maybe the last thing I'd say, if we're handing off to for 48 hours in the triage, my last little list is that if you're going to be second guessed by a regulator, by a commercial partner, by your workforce, but whoever's ox got gored by this event, you're basically second guessed on one of 3 legs of a stool. The first is like, what happened? Well, that's in the past and I can't change it. It will have its own root cause. Those facts are going to come out, but I got 2 other legs in my stool. And that's where I'm hustling with the client in the first 40 hours and every day thereafter to work on the other 2 legs. One is mitigating impacts on third parties. You can really float the boat. If you messed up, you didn't have MFA, I can't fix that fact, but you're going to have really good priority from day one on mitigating impacts on third parties. And the third is just the excellence of the IR effort itself. When that's a first class effort, the quality of that effort and the attention and care to improving the security program will really help. And so I think of those as 3 legs of a stool, and I'll be like, well, I can't fix the past, but I'm going to have, from the first 48 hours, I'm going to be oriented toward all those things, because for second guessers, that helps. So that's my frame. Those are my 3 frameworks I like.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. I think you're exactly right. Convening the right team, having the right people in the war room to quarterback the different work streams that need to occur is critical. And then also knowing which third parties to contact and when, and getting the right experts on the field to help you with the state of play as you work towards containment and mitigation are really important. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will. And Will, why don't you talk to us a little bit about some of those third-party experts and what you recommend within the first 48 hours as making decisions for and relating to who to engage, and maybe some initial assessment and containment and mitigation initial steps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kari. So from a team perspective, it's certainly important to ensure that not only is from an internal perspective, you've got your typical incident response team that is designed to respond to data security incidents, but you also need to have the other core departments also participating in that initial meeting, right? So you want to have your business continuity disaster recovery team, your communications team, your operations teams, because there is going to be some need for discussion about the impact to the organization and your ability to continue operations. And then obviously the third parties that Jen touched upon earlier, right? Your external forensics, your ransom negotiation firm, your outside counsel, your potential need for having loss experts involved if you do have business interruption or network interruption insurance, somebody to be able to track that, particularly the cost and lost revenue that you may incur. So having the right team in place is the first step, and then having the right governance structure around that to ensure that while you recognize that not everything that is communicated or produced during the incident response is going to be privileged, having a tight governance structure really helps you ensure that documents that shouldn't be created and that could be damaging aren't created. And so you've got a good governance structure around each of the work streams. But once you start really assessing the overall incident, the first thing that the organization really needs to do is assess the impact of the ransomware attack on the organization. That really means getting visibility to understand the scope of systems that are impacted and what operational effect the unavailability of those systems is going to cause to the organization. Is it only a portion of the systems that are encrypted? Are certain applications impacted? And what's that impact to your ability on your ability to service your clients and as well as your employees to do their day-to-day jobs? So you also need to be thinking early on about those immediate containment steps. Based upon what that initial assessment is, can we just isolate impacted systems? Is there a way to segment the portion of those systems in your environment from the rest of your system so you can keep those remaining systems operational? Do you really need to go all the way and disable all of your network ingress and egress, which is effectively going to shut down the organization? A lot of thought needs to be put into that, and it needs to be very clear who has the authority to approve such a move. You need to start checking your backups immediately. Do they seem to be impacted? And whether or not there's some additional security mechanisms or steps you can take to ensure that those are secure, even as you continue to assess. And then once you really have an assessment of the incident, then there's really 5 critical work streams that need to be established. The first is based upon that assessment of the impact to the operations. Starting that business continuity work stream. What workarounds can be implemented right now to ensure that those critical business functions have a minimized impact? And that takes a lot of pre-planning, which I'm sure the other panels are going to talk about, but it's really critical to start getting the right people in the room to talk about what workarounds can be implemented based upon the impact to your systems and applications. The second work stream is your forensic investigation and containment. As Jen mentioned earlier, we want to get visibility as quickly as possible into the environment to understand what happened, how it happened, what are the scope of the systems affected, so that we can start to develop a containment plan, so that we can ensure that the threat actors do not have the ability to maintain presence in your environment. And if you don't pay, potentially launch another ransomware attack. So that's critical. And it's also critical to the third work stream, which is recovery and restoration. That means establishing the team that's responsible for restoring systems based upon the criticality of those systems to the organization. So there needs to be a clear cadence of what systems need to be brought back online from a priority perspective to getting your network up and running again, all the way to which applications do we need to restore first, because they're going to have the largest impact on our ability to continue operating in a normal capacity. And that recovery and restoration phase is really dependent upon that forensic investigation and containment. Before we can bring systems back online, we really need to understand whether or not they pose a security risk to the organization. So to Jen's point earlier, having a forensics firm that can tell us very quickly, because they have the tools, the expertise, which systems are clean and can go back into restoration. So that security validation is not holding up putting those systems back into operation. The other thing that's really critical about the restoration phase is making sure forensic evidence is preserved. Too many times we see clients go ahead and start wiping devices and trying to get those critical systems back up and running, but doing so in a way that doesn't preserve the forensic evidence makes it impossible sometimes for our forensics team to tell us what happened, what was the scope of the data that was potentially impacted. So it's crucial to have the governance around that recovery and restoration effort to ensure that evidence is being preserved. The fourth work stream is the communications work stream, and Evan's going to talk a little bit about that more earlier, but it's really two different prongs. Number one, from the impact on the encryption within our environment, what are our capabilities to communicate? Have our email been impacted? Have our telephones, because we have VoIP servers that run all of our telephone communications, have those been impacted? What alternative means of communications do we have to both internally and externally? So just the logistics of understanding the impact. And then the second, obviously, is establishing communications protocols to understand, as you start to implement these business continuity work streams to your employees and to your third-party vendors or customers, getting the communications out to them on what workarounds need to be put in place so they know what to do to minimize the impact on them. And then the final work stream is really the regulatory and law enforcement work stream. Do you have any immediate obligations within that first 48 hours or even 72 hours to notify any regulators? For example, in the EU, the unavailability of personal data itself can trigger a notification obligation to data protection authorities. And other industry-specific requirements, whether it's a financial institution subject to New York DFS regulation or a critical infrastructure subject to TSA or CISA regulation, you may have a 12 or 24-hour reporting requirement. And even beyond your required notification obligations to regulators, is it advisable, to notify, to give a heads up to your regulators, particularly in heavily regulated industries like financial institutions who are constantly having examinations ongoing? Is it better to go ahead, or in the energy sector, is it better to go ahead and give them a heads up rather than them learning about this 2 or 3 days later if it's in the media, even though you're not required? A lot of times it's best practice to just give them that heads up, but you need to be prepared with very specific talking points and communications, particularly if you're dealing with a bunch of different regulators and you have different owners who are managing those relationships. Everybody needs to be singing from the same hymnal book. And then finally, you need to alert your insurer, right? You need to make sure that they're on board, particularly as you think about your hiring your vendors and as well as paying the ransom. So those are the what I view as sort of the 5 critical work streams.
Great, thank you, Will, so much. In talking about those work streams and those priorities, I'll turn it over to Michelle just to query. Michelle, how do some of these work streams change if the attack involves encryption only or extortion only, meaning exfiltration and extortion only, or both? What should companies be thinking about in prioritizing their work streams depending on the nature of the attack?
Sure. So I think at a high level, many of the basic issues that Jennifer will hit on are going to have similarities across both types of events. You're going to want to think about people. Who are the people that you need in the room? Processes, all of those issues Jennifer talked about. But the key distinction is really the business disruption and operations component of an encryption event, which is very different, and which is the one thing that, as Jennifer mentioned, as companies planning, isn't something that always is thought about early in preparation, and can cause that extra struggle as companies figure out who are the right people that I need in the room. Having the folks that can work on business continuity, that can just assess the systems, that know what the systems do, any external restoration experts that you need to assess those issues. You're going to have external experts. You're probably going to have your threat intelligence negotiator under either scenario. In the case of extortion, you're going to want to get whatever information you can about what data they actually have. And you're going to have a work stream that's focused on both getting information from the threat actor and then understanding your own systems. You may be getting very high level information of, we've hit this part of the company, and then you need the folks in the room that can answer the questions of what data is there and focused on the investigation. The other, we haven't talked about communications yet, we will. I think that's the other key difference, is in an encryption event where there's an operational hit, your hand may be forced to talk a lot earlier than you want to. And that's, you're going to have a communication stream either way. But in an extortion event, you want to have those holding statements, but you probably have time to wait. And if almost anything there, it can be an exercise in restraint. Sometimes we had talked about how ransomware is a broad term that folks use to cover both types of events. And I've been in some where, people understand that it's a ransomware event and there's a sense of urgency that you almost have to tamp down in an extortion event, because in many ways it's very similar to any other data breach. Your systems have been infiltrated, data has been exfiltrated. The difference is that you've been informed by the threat actor, they have data, and there is that risk that they could leak it, but that's what your holding statements are for, and you do have some time to investigate. So those are some high level differences.
Great, thank you. On the communications front, to your point, if it is an encryption event and your systems are down, though we would always like to be able to be thoughtful about our communications and wait until we know more to be able to communicate. You're not always in a position to be able to do that, because you're going to get questions from your employees, you're going to get questions from your customers about, I can't access XYZ product or platform, or I can't access my email to do my work or to answer questions from customers. So in those situations, you're going to be forced to communicate about your incident or about the ransomware attack much sooner than you may be prepared to or you may want to, and certainly at a point in time before you know the whole nature, scope, and extent of the attack. And so being thoughtful about those communications to your employees, to other third-party vendors, to your customers is going to be really important so that you don't create greater risk of litigation and or regulatory inquiry down the road. So Evan, why don't you talk to us a little bit about your, what you recommend in terms of crafting those communications and the different types of communications you should be prepared to hold or have ready in the event you need them, and the cadence for which you would share those communications.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kari. I think really the first exercise that organizations that are hit with ransomware really need to go through in that first 24, 48 hours, which is when the most mistakes are made, is a stakeholder prioritization exercise, which is, it comes down to the same questions that Michelle and Will and Jennifer were talking about, which is, what does this look like to people? So essentially, what can folks see? What looks like it's going wrong? Did employees see ransom notes pop up on their computers? Do we have a loss of access to email? Are critical applications down that mean that customers can't engage with us the way they're used to? That really helps inform who you need to talk to, how you need to talk to them, and when. Generally, we find that internal communications are really the first step. Even if things are obvious externally that something is going wrong, you need to control the message internally, because without that, you're going to have a raft of folks across your company who engage with customers, engage with outside audiences, speculating that something may be going wrong. So really, we generally see that the first thing that companies need to do is inform their employees to a certain extent about what is going wrong. Customers really become the next most important stakeholder, particularly if you're the type of company where customers are engaging directly with you through applications or other means where they can't do business with you the way they're used to doing it. I really tend to think of things like media, which has traditionally been sort of where a PR person would be focused, as lower down on that priority list. Yes, you need to have a holding statement for media. Yes, it needs to be consistent with what you're saying to your other stakeholder audiences, but the media isn't feeling the pain of a ransomware incident, whereas employees and customers very well may be. Another thing that you really need to think about is, how are we going to describe this incident? I think historically, the drive has been, let's play out the string of, we're having technical disruptions as long as you possibly can. But honestly, in a world, post-colonial pipeline, JBS, Kaseya, the really high-profile incidents that have drawn a lot of attention to ransomware, if a company's systems are down, their network is down, and people can see that, really the first thing people are going to assume is it's ransomware. And ransomware isn't the dirty word that it used to be. And if you go 3 or 4 days saying, oh, we're having an IT issue, people are smart enough to know that like someone didn't spill coffee on a server somewhere. There's a real problem. And so really we're seeing companies getting more comfortable, and we're advising them to say, hey, say it's ransomware, because so often we find that our clients, their customers, the response isn't, oh my God, I'm terrified, it's ransomware, or how could you possibly let this happen? So often it's, I'm really sorry that happened to you. That happened to us 8 months ago. And they're willing to work with you if you can be a little bit more transparent about what the distinct issue is. Now, as far as what can go wrong in the first 24 to 48 hours, you have to communicate. Generally, particularly if it's an encryption event, your hand is forced, as Michelle said. But where we really see issues is when folks over-communicate, over-promise, or make statements that we know they can't possibly know are true. So I've seen this happen multiple times. We get engaged, and I see Jen shaking her head. I'm sure she's seen it too, where we get engaged a few days after an incident, and I see that somebody from a company or a municipality or whoever got hit went out and did an interview in the first day that said no data was taken as a result of this incident. We all know, everybody on this panel, and frankly, everybody in the audience knows, there is no way you can know that in the first 2 days. And so what we always try to advise folks to do is think about communications as a narrative that builds upon itself and reinforces the facts you've communicated previously. So that's why it becomes really important to describe what you're doing early, talk about the investigation, talk about the fact that you've engaged expert third parties, as Jen was talking about, and that you will let folks know when you know more. But those really definitive statements early on in an incident can come back to bite you, because if you have to start walking things back a week, 2 weeks later, the investigation finds one Excel spreadsheet in the exfiltrated data that nobody thought was there, that's got a couple 100,000 social security numbers on it, and you have to go back to everybody and say, oh wait guys, I was wrong. Remember when I said no personal data? We just found it. All your credibility is shot, and everything you say subsequent to that, people are still going to question, well, I don't really know if I buy that because they said there was no personal data and now they found it. So really, the first 24 to 48 hours, you're laying that foundation that you can build your messaging upon as things go forward. I think the other thing that you want to be ready for in those early days is, what are the questions you're going to get asked? Questions like, what kind of data was impacted? Questions like, what's your restoration timeline? Questions like, what's the root cause? And you really have to train people to be comfortable saying, I don't know right now, but I will let you know when I do. That's a really difficult position to put your sales teams in, people who engage with outside parties, but either getting them comfortable to do that or centralizing that communications work stream as it connects to external parties so that you're giving consistent answers across the board is really, really critical. So getting that infrastructure in place in the first couple of days, how are we going to engage outside the organization? Who is and who is not authorized to talk to folks? That becomes really, really important, because tracking and understanding what you've said, and this is something that my fellow panelists who are all attorneys will know, is important for minimizing your risk, because somebody sends some email to somebody speculating about the incident, that can just open you up both from a reputational standpoint and a legal standpoint. So really, Kari, those are the critical pieces of comms in the first couple of days that you need to be thinking about to set you up for relative success in the future.
Thank you, Evan. You're exactly right. It's often those off-the-cuff responses from employees or the overstatement that Jennifer and Michelle and Will and I find have been included in the complaints against which we are defending our clients when there's litigation that results from a data incident. So being really thoughtful about those communications and taking a measured approach to what you're saying and not overstating things or misstating things to the best of your ability is really critical for risk mitigation down the road and for building that narrative when you have to talk to regulators or private parties who are threatening litigation. So one area that Will touched upon earlier when we talked about different third parties and or entities to communicate with was law enforcement. And I know there's a lot of times the idea of contacting law enforcement or the FBI makes companies uncomfortable, right? The question becoming, well, does that make me the target of their investigation? Are they going to be scrutinizing my activities? Will involving them disrupt my priorities, well, I have to spend a lot of time working with them. That is time better spent addressing the incident response. So, Michelle, what are some of your thoughts and recommendations as it relates to contacting or working with law enforcement in responding to a ransomware attack? What are some of the benefits to that?
But I think there, I would say the key thing to remember too is it's not one size fits all. Like everything we're saying, it's going to be dependent on the overall facts of the situation and as companies' priorities and other things. Certainly, if you're in a situation where the company is going to make a payment, you're going to want to notify law enforcement in advance of that, and probably a bit in advance of that, among other things, given OFAC guidelines that doing so could be a mitigating factor if you inadvertently make a payment to someone on the sanction list. But timely doesn't necessarily mean immediately, and there are, I think, a number of factors that are going to drive when in the process you take that step. One factor could relate to communications. Are you in a situation where you're already talking about the event publicly to customers and others? And doing so, it might actually be helpful if you can tell them we've informed law enforcement. That's something that can give third-party business partners or others confidence that you're handling the situation and getting all the information you can. Another question might be, can law enforcement provide helpful information? On this front, I always like to first consult my threat intelligence firm. I think, in many ways, in many situations, they have, as Jennifer mentioned, very good information of this is clearly this threat actor, this is this MO, this is what you can expect. But in other situations, they may even suggest talking to law enforcement that they might have additional information. So law enforcement could be a helpful information source. There is the factor that there's a lot going on immediately. And it may be that, especially with a company that wants to be involved in everything that's communicated, even if you notify them, that's not something that's happening in the first 24 hours, depending on what the overall cadence of the event is. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you could have the types of extortion events that, and we've had on the communications front, talked about exercising restraint there. I've had those events where even though you get a notice and there might have been contact, it turns out there was no access to any system that actually had personal data. There was no interruption, and once you've gone through the whole process, the event was a big nothing. And in those situations, there are companies that do have a preference for not notifying. I would say, in most actual ransomware events, you're going to notify at some point, but there's a question of when in the process that you do that. To minimize disruption, we frequently recommend that those communications are happening through counsel, which has a couple of different benefits. One, and we talked about privilege, and even though in some ransomware events, operations is a key focus, given the risk that there could be litigation resulting from this, privilege is something that we do pay attention to, and having counsel communicate with law enforcement reduces the risk of an inadvertent waiver of privilege and disclosing information in a form that you wouldn't want showing up in a lawsuit down the road. And secondarily, counsel can act as a good buffer. So law enforcement may want information, but as lawyers, we're pretty comfortable saying, no, we're pretty comfortable saying, we'll work on that and get back to you. And we can manage that in a way that doesn't disrupt the other work streams.
Thank you. And the big elephant in the room as we talk about engaging with law enforcement and some of the threat intelligence they may have beneficial to helping you navigate your incident responses. What about engaging with the threat actors? What about the ransom demand? What factors should companies take into consideration right out of the gate about whether to pay the ransom demand, whether to, in the first instance, respond to the threat actor? And if so, who should be responding to the threat actor? How should they be engaging with the threat actors? So, Jennifer, I wanted to turn it over to you to talk through the decisions and the issues that factor into whether to engage with a threat actor and whether to make a decision, or what needs to factor into making a decision about whether to pay a ransom demand.
Right. So since we're the first 48 hours panel, we know that we probably will not reach a firm and final decision in 48 hours about whether to pay. So I definitely reset the table, and I bet Will and Michelle do a lot with clients that sort of pivot that question to whether to engage. And so the default, you should be very hostile to the idea of paying. The law requires that you be somewhat hostile. You're paying known criminals. Like, let's all be realistic about what we're not going to, oh, we paid just to help our reputation, so we didn't have to talk about how terrible our security was. Or like, there's good reasons and there's less good reasons to pay. And so we want to reset the 48-hour, window with a whether to engage. And I think of that as a two-step. The first is as I and everyone has said, you're going to get a threat negotiator, a threat actor negotiator on your team, in your room, so that you can say, I have some business judgment rule here. I relied on experts that had hundreds of interactions with this threat gang, and I let all that information flood into my war room, so I had the best information I could have. The default on whether to engage is probably leaning yes, right? Like, so, and, I wouldn't say like Michelle, I like Michelle saying like, we're doing triage, it's going to vary, every time, but I heavily lean, I think it's almost 100% you should hire them. And more likely than not, you will all come to a good war room decision to engage with them. And then going forward for 48 hours, what I want you to have is some kind of a decision matrix, like some kind of a way that your business has done the triage. Hopefully before the first 48 hours, you had some checklists and ideas of things of what are my pain points, because security comes down to, I know what data, if it's stolen, is very impactful to my company. I've had clients lose CAD drawings of their most secret sauce, like the Coke formula, right? Like, what are my extreme pain points around data integrity and, operational things? So that's going to be the driver on whether to pay and how to justify it. So the key things, Will did a great job of going through some of these things, but it's the sensitivity of the data. Who stands to be harmed if that data does get dumped on, a happy blog or exposed, otherwise? What is the status of my backup situation with real world metrics that are trustworthy on what's my time to recover, right? And what's my time to recover on my own powers and abilities and preparation, and what's my time to recover realistically if I get the key? A key sounds like a nice, happy word, but actually recovering from backup, if it's you have a good backup, may be faster and easier than getting the key, which sounds simpler than it is. What's the urgency for backup restoration? Well, we're reporting our quarterly results in 3 days, or there will be business considerations on the urgency of getting to the data where maybe the key is an advantage. So understanding what is the value of a key, and then and kind of a way of having thinking like a little like your 8K analysis. If you're a public company, you got to kind of have a thing of like, what are the financial losses? What does a material financial event look like for us? Is this a nuisance? Is it meaningful but not severe? Is it very, very severe in that it could risk more than 10% of our revenue? It's massively disruptive to our customers, causing knock-on consequential damages. So I think my real summary point would be, before you get to the first 48 hours, it's very hard to do a proper should I engage, should I pay decision tree if you've never thought about it in advance, about what are my material choke points of pain. I want to add, if you're a public company, you were already supposed to have done these things. You're not stepping into like a brand new territory when a crisis happens. You were expected to prepare for many situations. And so you may be judged as already lacking, right? Already not having reasonable care around this topic if you go rolling into a ransomware attack without any sense of what your material, financial, or operational pain points are going to be, and what would choke you to the point. The last thing I want to say is you're going to be lockstep with your insurers, and the insurers they really vary a lot from carrier to carrier. Some of them are like, we'll have a 10-minute phone call. That sounds good. We love it when people pay. And some of them are really forcing you to populate a form or a something about what kind of duress you're under. So in the first 48 hours, that's another reason why you want to immediately start having kind of sophisticated thinking around what would your financial or operational pain points look like, and what does it mean if the data is not confidential, and what is your restoration timeline and struggle?
I think those are all great points, Jennifer, especially the point about you're not really going to be making a true decision about whether to pay within the first 48 hours, despite the fact that the ransomware organization is going to make this feel like, or appear in their ransom note, that this is the most urgent situation, pressing situation ever, and you only have 48 hours or you only have 36 hours to answer them. I think all of us here have experiences where those negotiations can, even if you aren't going to pay, can draw out for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And so you may be in a position where you are constantly evaluating your pain points or your pressure points, and those may evolve and change as you learn more about the incident and as you learn more about the data that may have been impacted by the incident. So with that, Will, I guess a question I have for you is, even if you know right out of the gate that you are not going to pay the ransom demand because you have viable backups, you can get your systems restored, you don't need the decryption key, and you're not particularly concerned about the sensitivity of the data that may have been impacted, even if you aren't going to pay, are there still benefits to engaging with the threat actor? Should you still engage with them? Why not? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a case-by-case basis, right? And whether or not you're confident this is a real incident and a real ransomware attack, and it's not just an attempt to extort money, but in most cases where you do have encryption. And at the outset, I kind of always caution clients who kind of have that mentality of like, in no circumstance will we ever pay, right? And so it's just like, you still got to keep an open mind and continue to evaluate through the process. But in terms of engaging with the threat actor, in almost all circumstances, it's going to be beneficial to do so for a number of reasons. First, if you engage with them, the less likely the threat actor is to use escalation tactics to get your attention. So that means, and there's a variety of methods that they use. They can contact your employees. They can contact your executives, your board of directors. They can even reach out to your key customers and purport to have exfiltrated some of their data from you. So there's a lot of pressure points that they can apply. So when you engage with them, they're much less likely to go in that direction because in their view, they have a fish on the hook. Another aspect of it is you want to obtain as much information as possible from the threat actor. And that can include just finding out what the demand is. Oftentimes the demand isn't included in the ransom note. So you need to even know what their amount is. Sometimes you were surprised at how low it is, right? Secondly, you want to even understand to make sure, even though your IT team is telling you that we're all good, we don't need any decryption key, you still want to know whether or not, you may need the decryption key down the line, because in 24 hours, a lot is still unknown, and certainly even within 48 hours. So we want to get proof that the threat actor has a working decryption key. We also, in cases where there's threats of data exfiltration, we want to get proof of life from the threat actor, sample files that the threat actor asserts that they have taken from your environment, not only to just establish the veracity of their assertion that they've taken data, but also to use those files. If we get those files, we can search within the environment where those files located, and that will give us a good sense of where we need to focus our forensic investigation for purposes of data exfiltration analysis. The other aspect is delay. I mean, the more time that you can delay the threat actor from either posting your organization as a victim on their shame site, the more time you have to prepare for communications. You also are less likely to have your data posted by the threat actors in that time. And it also helps you build time to understand how the threat actor got in, implement containment steps, because if you do not pay, there's a much higher probability that the threat actors are going to try to re-infiltrate your environment and encrypt your systems.
Thank you so much, Will. And I know we just have a few seconds left here. And so with that, I will thank everybody for joining us today. We hope you found our practical tips and advice for dealing with ransomware attacks useful. The key points being, convene the right folks, provide and perform the initial assessment to understand initial impact, understand the experts that you will need in the room to help you quarterback the different work streams. Don't panic, be thoughtful with your communications, alert your insurer, evaluate whether to engage with law enforcement, and have a decision matrix that identifies the pain points that will help you determine whether and when you may want to pay ransom. So with that, we thank you so much, and thank you to Bruce.
All right, thank you. And Jennifer, Michelle, Will, and Evan, thanks so much. That's the way we get this conference started. That was fantastic. Our next panel is at 10:05 Eastern time. It's our first spotlight of the day. It's a one-on-one interview with Michael Lieberman of OFAC. So we will see you back here in 5 minutes. Thank you.